and unlimited masculinity can be, specifically the idea of non-toxic masculinity. So we'll talk a little bit about what toxic masculinity is, and then what non-toxic masculinity is and can look like. And then we'll just open it up for questions. I see there's a lot of people here, so I imagine we'll use the Q&A. I wish I could see all of your faces and we can talk directly, but I'm also excited that there's so many people and that y'all took time out of your lives to pull up to this digital event, even with everything that's going on in the world. So I am from Los Angeles, California. I grew up believing what a lot of, I think, young boys and are taught to believe, which was that my value as a person came from my ability to be a quote unquote real man. And that in order to be a real man, I had to be violent, I had to be emotionless, I had to have money, and I had to quote unquote have women. And I think this is really important, that first piece, and we'll come back to this when we get a little more philosophical, but I think it's really important to point out that piece about, I was taught that's where my value comes as a human being. And sometimes when we see men and boys acting out in ways that are so clearly destructive, it's easy to be like, what, why? Why are they doing this? But I can't stress enough that we are literally taught that what makes us worthwhile on this earth is dependent on that behavior, but more on that later. So I grew up believing that myth. I really started buying into it, I think, strongly when I got to middle school because of when my birthday hits. I started middle school when I was 10. Oh, y'all are in Canada. Maybe y'all don't have middle school there, but anyway, I got it at school when I was 10. The hardest, I think. Literally from the time I started the 6th grade, I started much more authentic. I started much more in my childhood and bag and in my joy bag and wearing bright colored shirts. And I like reptiles and lizards. And I had shirts that had like little geckos on it and stuff like that. And literally by the holiday break, so 3 months later, we start school in September. So by December, my wardrobe had completely changed because I had very quickly learned that my kind of artsy, bright colors, feminine, Spice Girls, musical, enjoying self was not okay. And that's not who I was supposed to be. And instead, I was supposed to be tough and all the things that we discussed earlier. And I think also because of the way that racism exists, it was a racialized patriarchy that I was taught as well. The stereotypes that I was taught about were not just about what made me a real man, but what made me a real Black man. And those stereotypes look like what we saw in the media of like gangsters and killers and thugs and shit like that. So that's who I decided to be. And by the time I was 12 years old, I was getting high, hanging out with gang members, really seeking to be that. By the time I was 13, I was selling drugs. And by the time I was 16, I was kicked out the house and gangbanging in the streets and selling drugs to support myself or to at least try to feed myself. So I think it's also important to say that simultaneously as this was happening, I was also being raised in a system that was based in these patriarchal principles as well. The criminal justice system also lends itself to the patriarchal idea that domination is power and that you, in order to win, you must dominate, or domination is what winning looks like. This is what patriarchy teaches us, right? And this is what we see in the American criminal justice system. So I grew up during a time where that they called zero tolerance. And the idea was that if you highly criminalize juvenile rule breaking, then kids won't grow up to be quote unquote criminals. So the first time I was arrested, I was 11 for like playing too rough at school. And the next time was, I was 13 for leaving school early. And then again, when I was 13 for like scraping the dirt off of my desk. And then I was like chokeslammed and arrested for speaking during school, like a school assembly when I was like 14 or 15 years old. So as I'm also kind of chasing this patriarchal narrative of who I should be as a young teenager and as a child, I'm also being raised in a patriarchal culture that praises law enforcement and police for acting out violence against young people, specifically young people of color. And really my saving grace was when I was 14 and I was failing out of school. Two young organizers came in who graduated from my high school a few years before, named Mark Anthony Johnson and Patrice Cullors. And they were training us on how to be organizers. And it was by being introduced to community organizing and the social justice community of Los Angeles that I really first experienced freedom and that I was okay. It was my first time being in women-led spaces and queer-led spaces. My first time being in feminist men's groups. The first feminist text that I read was We Real Cool by Bell Hooks, and then The Will to Change by Bell Hooks. And being in those feminist men's spaces, I was able to give hugs to men and get real hugs by men, not like fake bro hug with aggressive pats on the back, and be my whole self. And it was just the most freeing experience that I had ever had up until that point. So feminism was really a gateway to myself for me. But I was still very much concerned with being seen as a quote unquote real man, especially by my homies. So I was kind of living a double life, if you will, one in the organizing community and one in the streets. And I still eventually was kicked out of my house and incarcerated multiple times. The last time I decided to rob some pharmacies, and the state responded by beating me into a concussion, trying to give me 150 years to life, and I ultimately got 10 years and 2 strikes in state prison. And in prison, I wanted to be free, not just physically free, but also I wanted to experience that same spiritual freedom that I was able to experience in those feminist men's groups. And I really turned to feminist text to get back to myself, because I knew that a degree of my behavior was based on performance, and wanting to be what society told me I should be. It's funny, they say people go to prison for breaking the rules, but I don't believe that's true. I think people go to prison for following the rules that say we should be dominant, we should be violent, right? We should be, we should have money, and we should quote unquote have women or control people based on gender. Those are the real rules of our society. Kind of, I believe that patriarchy is the true religion of the United States and of much of the colonized world. And it is those of us who choose to follow that religion of patriarchy the hardest. Some of us get rewarded, become president of the United States. Some of us get punished and go to prison for years or decades or for the rest of our lives. And that usually just depends on our race and class. But anyway, I wanted to be free. So I started returning to feminist text, specifically the works of Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins. And eventually I started sharing that with others as well, because it was, just imagine, being in prison and you're seeing the very things you're reading about being played out in front of you with real serious violence, people getting stabbed, people getting shot by the cops being hella patriarchal. And at first I was very afraid to talk about feminism with anybody. And it wasn't even not talking about feminism. That's not the most accurate thing. I was afraid to push back against patriarchy and offer people a freer way of being, because I was afraid of what that would do to me. Because just like on the outside world, our value in prison is based on how patriarchal we're willing to be, but maybe even more so because there's nothing to dilute it. It's not like you can be tough guy outside and then come home and be yourself. There is no coming home. You are in the world of patriarchy 24/7. So I was terrified to share any of the learnings that I had that had freed me. And I remember the first time I did it, I was on my bunk. We are on lockdown. I was reading We Real Cool. And I'm on the top bunk. My cellie's on the bottom bunk, so he can't see me. And he's telling a story. And in the story, every time he referred to women, he referred to them as the B word, which is unfortunately very common, at least out here. And I remember putting my book down on my chest, and I was physically shaking. Because, you know, prison is serious. If you're seen as somebody who can be victimized and taken advantage of, that can cost you a lot, possibly even your life. So I was very afraid to say anything. But in that moment, I decided to. And I said, bro, do you only call women the B word? And he just kind of like made fun of me and laughed it off and told me to shut the fuck up or whatever. And that was, you know, a little embarrassing, but nobody punched me in the face. Nobody stabbed me, right? And that kind of became the beginning of me pushing more and more until eventually about a year and a half after that, I started a program called Success Stories that Sarah talked a little bit about in the beginning, which is where we help ourselves, and I'm not incarcerated anymore, but where we work with system impacted young men to free themselves by challenging their own patriarchy and toxic masculinity. And when we first started the program, did not go well. I got laughed out of the room. And it took years to learn that the program did not succeed if we were teaching about patriarchy. The program succeeded if we were being vulnerable about our own patriarchy and then inviting others to do the same. So CNN came, made the documentary, it came out, and now we've been able to expand Success Stories into 11 prisons, county jail, multiple reentry facilities, and we're trying to spread it all over the US, maybe even in Canada. Y'all have a similar culture to us. We just don't want to go, you know, patriarchy looks so different culture to culture, and we don't want to start stepping into spaces where we don't feel like we have the cultural expertise to have the conversation. So that's how I got here anyway. And I feel like it's important to say because I always want to be clear that I'm not some kind of expert or guru or I'm not here because I'm better than other men. I'm here because I am like other men. I'm here because I am those other men. I'm here because I actually have much more in common with abusers or people who have abused than I have in common with people who have been abused. And I'd like to think that I have what I have to offer is I've done some work on myself that has helped me move from being in a place where I base my value on how patriarchal I could be and how I could dominate to a place where I base my value in how I can love and how I can add value and how I can be authentic to myself. And that takes hard work, at least it does for me. And I think that the world will be a freer and safer place if more of us who share the privilege that I have did that work. So let's get into that. Toxic masculinity, as I said, I find to be best defined as a standard of masculinity. So it is not to say that masculinity in and of itself is toxic. One could question if masculinity in and of itself is even a thing, but we'll get to that. Toxic masculinity is a way of measuring masculinity. And we measure, if we are measuring our masculinity by our ability to be violent, by our ability to be dominant, by our ability to have money, by our ability to quote unquote have women, or I want to actually further complicate that further point. It's to dominate based on gender, which can be expressed through I'm more of a man because I've had many, women partners, but it also can be expressed as I'm more of a man because I'm cisgender, or I'm more of a man because you are less. I am important because you are not. I am here because you are there. And I think that's why we see so much violence against the queer community by cis men, because cis men are being taught that we get our value by being better than, more legitimate than, more normal than, more dominant than every other gender or non-gendered identity on earth. So if that's what toxic masculinity is, I want to talk a little bit about the implications of that. Like I had mentioned earlier, to be a young boy, and I just want to be clear, every time I'm using terms like boy or man or woman or girl, I'm talking about everybody who identifies with that. Yeah, I think it's important to say like a boy or a man rather than like masculine identified, because it's not just, that's not just how they identify, that's what they are. What they identify as is what they are. So yeah, regardless of if folks are cis or trans or non-binary masculine, non-binary femme, if I'm talking about a category and you relate with it, then I'm talking about you. So anyway, we are taught that we are not worthwhile human beings. I say we, boys, men, masculine folks. We are taught that we are not worthwhile as human beings unless we are dominating other human beings. I can't stress that enough. That's why we'll see people who are willing to die for patriarchy. I was willing to die for patriarchy. I was a gang member. I was willing to kill and be killed to be seen as a real man. When I got put on my gang, I was just talking to my homegirl about this the other day. She was there and she was like, why are you doing this? Everybody loves you. I said, I want everybody to respect me. She was like, everyone respects you. I said, I want them to respect me as a man. That was my 16-year-old justification for risking my life and that of my family and friends. It's everything. If I'm not a real man, then I'm not a worthwhile person. When we put it into words, it cheapens it. It makes it seem like, well, that's dumb. Why would anybody do that? But why does anybody do anything? Why do we get up and go to work in the morning? It has so much to do with how we see ourselves and our own value. So I tell people what I've learned is that when we're talking to men about patriarchy, know that you are talking to somebody who in their mind, they are in a fight. And you're asking them to put their hands down. And they believe that patriarchy is what is giving them value, what makes them worthwhile, what is keeping them safe in the world, what is protecting their families, what is giving them like their ability to sustain themselves. So when we're telling men to abandon patriarchy, we're literally telling them to abandon everything they know that keeps them safe, protects them in this world. And I don't say this to apologize for toxic or harmful behavior. I don't say this to justify the harm that comes from men and our patriarchy. I say this so that we can build understanding. And it's not always a space to build understanding. Oftentimes people who have been harmed by men don't want to hear this. And I don't blame them. I don't assert that they should need to sit through things like this. But you all made the bold choice to do this. And I imagine this is what you're interested in learning about. So here we are. I do believe it's a worthwhile conversation for those of us who wish to transform the behavior of men, which is directly linked to protecting survivors and making sure we don't have more survivors, right? So that's who we're talking to when we're telling men to let go of patriarchy. We're literally telling men to drop their hands in a fight that they think they're in. Now, we understand that the fight only continues as long as everybody has their hands up. And the more people who put their hands up, the fight actually ends. But to the person in their fight, it's a very tough ask. So if toxic masculinity is to have to base masculinity on, measure it by one's willingness to be violent, dominant, emotionless, and dominate based on gender, and have money, then what is non-toxic masculinity? Now, we can go point by point and show non-toxic ways of addressing these things, and I think that's an important thing to do, and I'm gonna do that. But I wanna first start by being more holistic than that, because it's not just about, instead of basing yourself on money, base yourself on this. Instead of dominating gender, like, it's not piecemeal, right? I think it's a holistic, it's a whole other way of being. So what Bell Hooks talks about is the opposite of patriarchy being integrity. Bell Hooks teaches us that the opposite of patriarchy is integrity, or the idea of being one whole person that doesn't compartmentalize, and one who centers love, which she defines. She used M. Scott Peck's definition, which is love is the spiritual investment of oneself into something or someone that they care about. Or rather, the investment of oneself into the spiritual growth of something or someone that they care about. Bell Hooks talks about when we are basing our value, when we're basing our lives in that, we are in integrity, as opposed to basing ourselves in the patriarchal expectations that are placed upon us. So I want to start there first. And that's why I said, I don't know if people often ask me all the time, well, if a real man isn't one that protects his family and has money and has, a bunch of girlfriends and is whatever, then what is a real man? And what I tell folks in success stories is, I'm not interested in helping you be a real man. I'm interested in helping you be the real you. I'm not interested in being a real man. I'm interested in being the real me and being the real Richie, which may sometimes fall into ideas that we consider to be masculine, or may sometimes fall into ideas that we consider to be feminine, or ideas that we consider to be agender. It doesn't matter, because gender is not the goal. Authenticity is the goal. And from that perspective, I want to start with that perspective when we talk about what is non-toxic masculinity. I would say non-toxic masculinity is masculinity that seeks to be authentic rather than that seeks to be masculine. Fuck being masculine. And it's not that being masculine is a bad thing. I'm just saying, like, that is not my goal. I shouldn't wake up to be like, how can I be masculine today? What does that serve? I would like to live in a place where I wake up and say, how can I be authentic today? How can I be loving today? How can I contribute to what I understand my destiny to be today? How can I contribute to my community today? And when I do that, sometimes people might experience that as masculine. Sometimes people might experience that as feminism. Gender is a box of assumptions, right? A gender is literally a box of assumptions. When I tell you that my gender, that I am a man, you now have a roster of assumptions about me, that I got a dick, that I like the pronouns he, him, that I like the color blue, that I like sports, right? All these assumptions are assigned to the word man. And we've been breaking down these assumptions, and that's important. And but I'm not trying to, I don't think there's any value in replacing some of those assumptions with new assumptions. I actually think it's more beneficial that we get rid of the assumptions and we just see people as their authentic selves. But I guess that's work about ending the gender binary, and that's a longer conversation. But anyway, I believe that our entry point to non-toxic masculinity is to seek and encourage authenticity among men, instead of trying to find some new harm-reduced standard by which to measure men and masculinity. We shouldn't be measuring men and masculinity. We should just be encouraging men and masculine people to be their authentic selves, and to love themselves and their communities. So with that said, let's go point by point and look at if we choose that, what effects does that now have on these toxic standards of masculinity that we see in toxic masculinity? And it might seem, I hope it doesn't seem like I'm playing word games, but you see the difference. Rather than base yourself on money, we do this. It's not about that. It's about when we choose authenticity over performance, then we will inevitably see that instead of basing ourselves on money, we base ourselves on something else, right? So let's approach it from that perspective. At least that's what's helpful for me. When seeking authenticity and integrity instead of standards of masculinity, what I have experienced in myself, and obviously I'm still doing work on myself and will always, but what I have experienced with myself and with the folks that I work with is that instead of basing ourselves on on if we're violent or not, we base ourselves on if our choices represent our values. people often ask me, what if you're being attacked and I can't be violent? What if someone's attacking my family? I'm supposed to just let that happen? Absolutely not. But there's a difference between self-defense and pride defense. There's a difference between I'm doing what I have to do to now protect my body or the bodies of people who I care about, and this idea that, oh, you crossed me, now I'm about to teach you a lesson by showing you how violent I can be. That's pride defense. That's violence. That's based in toxic masculinity. That is not self-defense. Self-defense can look like running, right? But that doesn't always feel good to our pride. So that's something we can look at. If we're truly looking to get rid of these toxic ways of measuring ourselves, which is not freaking easy, even for me. In terms of getting our value from money, also hard to let go of. I mean, even I look at myself, for most of the time I've been out of prison 2 years now, and a few months after I got out, a friend of mine gave me a car. He did a thing where someone gave him a car when he got out. So he gave me a car when I got out, and I just recently gave it to someone else when he got out. And, it's an old car, 1992 Acura Integra, dented up. And I felt embarrassed, especially as a producer, because I do cultural work. So I do organizing around these ideas, but I also make music and films about these ideas. And, when I'm on set or when I'm at the studio producing and I'm pulling up in an old 1992 Acura, I felt embarrassed because at some level I knew that I'm being measured by those around me based on the car that I drive. I talked about this in an article I wrote for Playboy, actually, on non-toxic masculinity. But anyway, it's not easy to let go of those things, especially when we know other people around us are buying into them. And I really wanted to get like a fancier car. And I still feel those desires, but what I had to just remind myself of, at least what works for me, and this is, kind of spiritual, but it works for me, is it helps me in those moments to think about my ancestors. It helps me in those moments to think about the people who worked hard, who are still living, for me to be what I am today and have what I am today, have what I have today, in all senses of the word. And that helps me to kind of divest myself from that like patriarchal capitalist way of thinking, is to remember like, wow, there's so many people who did so much for me to be where I am. And they would be so proud of me. They would be so proud of me to see where I am today. And they're not looking at what kind of car I'm driving. They're looking at what kind of value I add to the world. And when I base myself on the value I'm adding to the world, the value I'm adding to the community, rather than, the value I spent on my car, it helps me divest from that toxic way of measuring myself. When it comes to emotionlessness, I think again, when we're seeking to be authentic instead of seeking to be truly masculine, with authenticity comes emotions. It's inevitable. As I seek to have integrity, as I seek to have authenticity, I'm also seeking to express my emotional self. And I get to be freed from those invisible chains of having to be emotionless and tough all the time. And finally, when talking about the ways that men are taught that we get our value from dominating based on gender, and I wanted to save this for last because I feel like there's a lot to say here, especially given the topic of that we're all talking about over these 2 days. I think it's so crucial here. That when we as men are basing our value on our integrity and our authenticity, that we understand that the buck starts and stops with us. That nothing that anyone else is doing, or how they look, or how they treat us, or how they're attracted to us or not attracted to us, or how they wield to us or not wield to us, has nothing to do with what makes us important. There was a person who used to live on my street, and he would sit on a corner pretty much all day and night. I believe he was unhoused, though I don't know his life. He was older. He would be really drunk. And he would just harass all the women that walked by. Like every woman that walked by in either direction, he would say something to them. And that's what he did day and night. And I spoke with him a couple times, but the first time I spoke with him, I walked up and said, hey bro, why did you say that? Why did you say that right now? And he started telling me about, first he acted like he didn't hear what I said. And he started telling me about some album he was working on and how he was like, man, whatever I said doesn't matter, but I want to talk to you about this album. And he kept trying to talk about the album. And I realized this is a person who wants to feel important. This is a person who feels unseen, who feels valueless, right? This is a person who lives in poverty. This is a person who is Black. This is a person who appears to have some kind of addiction. And to sit on this corner, his like male privilege is kind of all he got. So he sits here and harasses women to make himself feel powerful. And again, this isn't a conversation that I'm encouraging everybody to have, but because of my privilege, I was able to have this conversation, with relative safety. When I talked to him, I wanted to talk to him about that. And tell him like, yo, what you're saying makes people uncomfortable, fam. And like really uncomfortable. And you don't got to say that. Like, you're important by yourself. You matter, and you don't got to get at people like that to feel like you're important or you matter. And it was just one conversation, and he apologized. I mean, he didn't say it to me, but the person who he said something to that kind of activated me to go say anything to him was my partner at the time. And he was like, oh, tell her I apologize. And that's cool, but that's not the moral of the story. Isn't really that he apologized. The moral of the story is that he was harassing others. He was seeking to dominate people based on their gender because the power that his male privilege gave him was the only power that he felt like he had. And I think so much of our work, for those of us who do the work of working with men, so much of our work is about showing men that their power and value doesn't come from dominating others, that it's inherently in them, and investing in their power and their value, investing in their dreams for themselves, and showing that they don't, that they can self-actualize, and we don't have to hurt others or dominate others in order to have value. I think this is it's not an easy conversation to have. It's not always going to happen in that soft way. But the posture of heart that I have found to be the most helpful is that when people sometimes come to me and they're like, my kid is wilding out, my kid is gangbanging, or, my uncle is always saying misogynist things. I often say, two things. Help them see the results of their actions, not you're wrong and you shouldn't do this because you're wrong. That's not, who are you to tell me I'm wrong? I don't give a fuck about what you think. That's what they're thinking. But rather, what is the harm? What does it do to people when you act like this? And help them come to that reality. And then two, to show them you don't gotta be like this, fam. Like, your value is inherent to you. It doesn't come, it's not because you're hetero. It's not because you're a dude. It's because you are the only you that will ever exist. And it is when we as men are basing our value in the fact that we are the only us that will ever exist. It is when we as men are basing our value in being authentic and feeling our feelings and seeing them as blessings and being our truest selves. It is when we as men are basing our value in how we spiritually invest into ourselves and others that we get to be authentic, that we get to be whole, that we get to be healthy, and that we get to be non-toxic and masculine. So I hope that's helpful. usually right then I would say thank you, and people would clap, and it would be a whole moment. And then we'd open up for questions. But because everyone else is muted, I'm just going to leave it there and turn it over to Sarah for questions.
Thanks so much, Richie. We're actually going to bring Paul on, who works for the Sexual Assault Center Waterloo region in the Male Allies program, and they are going to help facilitate the questions, and I'll pop back on at the end.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Richie. That was so inspiring. Just love that. I had a huge smile on my face the whole time watching. Such beautiful words. Love to hear that from another man. So thank you so much. Yeah, so I've been tracking the questions coming in a little bit here, and I would encourage folks, if you have questions, to put them in the question and answer box, and we'll get to as many as we can. So Richie, when you were telling the story about sitting on your bunk, reading your book, and you're listening to your cellmate describing this feeling of like, oh, I know I want to challenge this person, and that kind of shaking feeling coming up, I could relate to that so much. And I know other people in the chat here have been bringing that up too. So one question that Mark was asking was also relating to that feeling, but do you have any tips or other examples you have of like gently approaching a situation where you wanted to protect your vision of your authentic self, but we're met with confrontation? So like, how might we pivot from getting defensive and trying to dominate in that situation?
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. That I really appreciate that question. So yes, I have you specifically asked if I have other examples. So I can definitely speak about other examples, but I want to say something before giving an example. Is I think it's so important to approach that question for them, like for not only for the person who we're going to be who you're going to be talking to, but also for the sake of the results we're trying to create in the world and the people who we're trying to be allies to and the people who are trying to support, right? Women and non-binary people. Because it's also really easy to have those conversations for us. Like, dang, if I don't say something, then I am not a real ally, then I am not a real feminist. And now it's all about me. And I'm actually trying to protect my ego. And now I have to make this other person like say something and kind of wield to my way of thinking. I think most of us on the call would agree that it is the way of thinking that harms less people. But either way, to that person, it's just my way of thinking. And if I'm trying to get them to wield to my way of thinking so I can feel better, that also I think is based in an idea of like, I am more valuable if I dominate you. That also is it's ego-centered, and it's not necessarily centered in what's going to be helpful to others. And it shows. It shows when we're coming from that place. And I try to check myself in those moments where I feel like I got to say something. I'm like, do I want to say something right now because I want to dismantle patriarchy and I want to make the world a safer place? Specifically for women, non-binary people, but for everybody? Or do I want to say something right now so that I can feel like I'm a real feminist and that I feel okay? And if it's the second one, then I work on myself to get it to be the first one before saying show. I believe that our intentions equal our results. So with all that being said, I can think of so many examples. I have these conversations a lot, and I do tell you that they get easier and easier, but they never get easy. I can tell you an example of a time where I failed, and I can tell you an example of a time where I feel like I succeeded. A time where I failed, I remember I was getting my hair cut by someone who I want to say I found them online. I didn't know them. I didn't know the barbershop. I didn't know the context. I didn't know anybody. And dude was telling me a story, and he kept referring to somebody as the B word, a woman in the story as the B word. And I remember thinking like, I want to say something about this. I don't want to just be complicit in this. And I didn't feel like I had an entry point. I felt really nervous. I'm like, I don't know this dude. I don't know nobody in this barbershop. So I didn't say anything. And I feel like that was a missed opportunity to challenge culture, to challenge patriarchal culture. And when I look back on it, it's still hard for me to think of what I would say, but it's only hard for me to think of what I would say if I'm also trying to protect how I look in the space. If I'm willing to let go of how I look on the space, and I'm willing to be seen as a little bit of a weirdo, then it becomes a lot easier to say something. Then I just say whatever. But I'll also tell you about times where I succeeded. I remember there was a time where I was working out with somebody, and I keep using these examples of when people are using the B word. I don't know why that's what's coming to me right now, but as many of you know much better than I do, that's not the only way misogyny and patriarchy looks. But I was working out with somebody, and he was using the B word, and I just asked him why. I was like, why do you call women that? And he was like, what do you mean? Why not? Like, he assumed that I meant like you shouldn't cuss. I think he started saying something like, you're right. I should just use more respectful language. I shouldn't be cussing like that. And I'm like, no, I mean, cuss your ass off. I don't think there's any actual harm in that. But I was like, I told him I think there's a difference between language that's like offensive, like cussing, and language that's oppressive, like the B word. And I talked to him about how that word is used often in moments of violence, specifically between men and women. When men are attacking women, they use that word, whether it be in street harassment, whether it be in DV situations, right? And you don't know what you can be bringing up for people when you say that word. You're like reinforcing and normalizing that culture. And he heard me out. And this was in prison. We were working out in prison. I think people assume that if you're in prison, you can't grasp these concepts, but of course he could grasp the concept, and it was a good conversation. And it's not like he never said it again, but when he would say it, he would like catch himself and kind of look at me like, oh shit, like oppressive language. And I don't know, that moment felt good. And I use that moment in particular because it wasn't about me being right or me just being like, don't say that, and him being like, okay. It's like, I felt like it was a moment where he really got it, and he really saw how using that word contributed to a culture that actually harms people.
Awesome. Thank you, Richie. I can relate to that so much. I think addressing the B word has probably been like the most common way I've entered into conversations with other men about patriarchy and unpacking those things together. So very cool. I had a question from somebody who was talking about how the prison system to them is sort of like the epitome of patriarchy and toxic masculinity, and how if we want to sort of address that system, we want to address toxic masculinity, we also need to address that prison system. And I know you do a lot of that work as well. So can you give us a glimpse into how you see those things intersecting and how that influences your work on both sides?
Yeah, I can. I want to say one more thing that I almost forgot to say about the last question, because it's so important to me. I also think it's important that when we talking to people about patriarchy, that we talk regular. And by that I mean, if we're going to use big words like patriarchy and misogyny, like we have to define what those words mean. But I think it's more helpful to talk about results and lived reality than it is to use buzzwords. We're using them a lot here because I'm at, it's college. We all came here. We talk about this. We shoot this shit. But with the average person, I think it's important that we talk regular and that it doesn't feel inaccessible. But to address this question, yeah, I appreciate that statement. I agree with whoever said that. That the prison system is the epitome of patriarchy, because I kind of extrapolated this definition of patriarchy from Bell Hook's definition of patriarchy, that patriarchy is one, the idea that domination is power, and two, the idea that cisgender heterosexual men are inherently dominant. It is only within patriarchy that it is only within a world where domination is power that we would, if you take a situation like mine, I robbed 3 stores. The people were not given their money back. The people who were in the stores who were traumatized, who were likely traumatized, were not offered any kind of counseling or help. There's no reconciliation effort made between me and those people. There was no questioning into why my little ass was running around doing stuff like that. There was no attempt to change my behavior. Those are all the things that one would assume would happen after something harmful like what I chose to do. But instead what happened is LAPD showed up, beat the hell out of me, and tried to send me away for 150 years to life. Ended up you know, holding me at gunpoint away from my family in a very dangerous, very traumatizing place for 7 years. How is that a response to what I did? What does that have to do with what I did? What does that have to do with the people who were robbed? In fact, when I wrote the people in those stores, I say the people I robbed because you can't rob a store, you rob people in a store, right? When I wrote the people who I robbed and I wrote the owners of those stores and apologized and seek to offer accountability and seek to show them that I understood the harm that I committed and how deeply committed I was to, one, not only not doing it again, but trying to build a world where it doesn't happen, period. I got a letter from the district attorney saying if I ever contact them again, that she's going to file new charges on me. So that is just one example of how our system seeks to dominate. It does not seek to offer us justice. It doesn't seek to offer healing. It doesn't seek to transform behavior or offer safety. It seeks to dominate, and then it calls that justice and healing and safety. But we instinctually know that that's not what those things are. But in many other ways, I mean, literally every one of those tenets of toxic masculinity, violence, emotionlessness, putting money before everything, gender domination, the system does all those things, right? The system is extremely violent. It kills people, it kidnaps people. They call it arrest, but same thing. It beats people up. It destroys families. It holds people at gunpoint against their will. The system is completely puts money before people. We have a system where law enforcement fights to grow the system so they can grow their budgets, not necessarily because their services are needed anymore. They seek to change laws so that the same crime that gave you 5 years yesterday gives you 50 years today, not because that crime suddenly became more dangerous, but because there's more money to be made if there's more people locked up. And we have private companies that sell things to incarcerated people and their families. And yeah, they're putting money before human lives, just like I did in those pharmacies, by the way. And then on the gender side, I mean, prisons, one, assume a gender binary that we know doesn't exist. Prisons, the entire prison industrial complex makes its money mostly off the pockets of women. There's an amazing report called Who Pays that was done by SC Justice Group and the Ella Baker Center that pointed out that at least in America, 1 in 4 American women have an incarcerated loved one, and 1 in 2 Black American women have an incarcerated loved one. And most of the money that goes into these prison profiteering companies, the companies that, you know, give us telephones, that sell us telephone services and sell us shoes and sell us toothbrushes and sell us access to our families, the grand majority of that money comes from the pockets of poor women. And when women go and visit prisons, because women make up the majority of visitors, regardless of the gender of the person incarcerated, women make up the grand majority of visitors across the board, at least in the US. Women are sexually harassed by the guards at an institutional level. They are slut shamed. They're told you can't wear this, you can wear this. Go stand in the sun. Let me see if your dress is see-through. Turn around. Let me look at your butt. Let me see if your pants are too tight. This is an institutionalized, written down practice, at least in California prisons. So every toxic thing about toxic masculinity is performed and exacerbated by the criminal justice system.
Thanks, Richie. Scrolling through the questions here, we have a few from female identified folks who are wondering about like their role in having conversations with men, and if there's any advice you can give on sort of like inroads or language that you might offer, especially for men who might be like defensive or have their back up about these types of conversations.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I think it's important to say, I feel like we as men, we as people who benefit from male privilege and benefit from the ways that patriarchy destroys others, I believe that we have a duty to push back against it. And women, non-binary people, I don't feel like have the same duty. I think it's important that just to say that I'm not insisting that y'all go holla at men about our bullshit in a way that can make you unsafe. And And I think it's important to point out that you preserving yourself, you know, within patriarchy and everything you're facing is also a way of fighting patriarchy and is also resistance and is also important. But for those of y'all who want to holla at fools about their patriarchy, I honor that. And I think what I've found to be helpful, language that I've found to be helpful, is to center the conversation again amongst lived reality. So I'll give you an example. If a man is saying something like misogynist, something based in rape culture, whatever, you name it, rather than approaching it and being like, you shouldn't say that, approaching it instead and being like, yo, this is my experience with the things that you are saying. Like, I've actually experienced that. This is what my lived reality actually looks like. And when you say those things, it makes me feel like this. Or when you say those things, you're contributing to that in this way. And making it real, keeping it in the realm of real life. Again, and you might not feel like disclosing your experience in that way, and that's totally fine. But that is what I have found to be the most effective. Because most people, the way that we see ourselves is like, I am a good person. I don't want to hurt anybody. So to just make it clear to somebody like, yo, fam, you are hurting me. And I don't think you're aware of it. But you are hurting me, gives people pause, as opposed to having a philosophical conversation about feminism and right and wrong and what somebody else should or should not be doing.
Richie, we have a question from somebody who has a young son, and they're wondering, like, if you do this work with men, or you also like have a model for talking with like younger men and boys about this, and how the language changes when you're doing that.
Yeah, I have worked with some kids. It is a different vibe, y'all. Working with kids is different. I primarily work with young adults, with like teenagers through the end of the age spectrum. But what I have learned, but I have done some work with middle schoolers, and in success stories, we have some cohorts where we're working with youth programs. And what I've learned is that kids just process things differently. Kids might be quieter. They might feel in real life. If you're talking to them online, you get to see a whole different side. They're usually real bold online. But my experience of working with young people is they might not say anything. They often feel like they have less to defend. And when they're defending patriarchal culture, they're kind of doing it with a question mark at the end. Like, wait, that's not right because of this, right? And they might not say it like that, but that's been my experience. I was talking to some kids in juvenile hall, and I was asking them about, we were talking about all these things we were talking about here, and they kept like looking at each other because they're trying to gauge from each other. They're trying to still figure out the world, and the world has been telling them patriarchy, 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 patriarchy. And if you were the first person to tell them not that, they're like, wait, are you tricking me? At least that's my experience of working with children. And to just be aware of that. Yeah. The specific question is, do I use different language? Again, I think it's helpful to keep everything in the realm of real life, to use examples, to use real life examples, rather than the realm of like words and buzzwords and philosophy and stuff like that. But to also just be understanding that they are very much learning, and they might not show you that they're listening, or they might not show you that they're ready to make a different decision, because they're really, really still learning about the world, and that's okay. If they don't say anything. I've done workshops. I did a workshop in a high school. Man, the kids were so quiet like the whole time. They didn't say it was so hard to get them to say anything. But I put my handle, my Instagram handle on the whiteboard before I left, which is what I always do. And when I say my DMs were full from these kids being like, dang, I learned so much here, and thank you for saying this, and wow, what about this, and asking questions about this, and they just communicate a little different. Maybe they're afraid to say it in front of each other. Maybe they feel more comfortable saying it online, but they were listening though.
Thanks, Richie. So somebody's asking, like, I don't know what's left of masculinity that's worth of redemption. They're asking, is it just fashion? Is there an attitude? What about masculinity? Couldn't also be seen in femininity? Yeah. Want to speak to that?
Yeah. Look, I do think it's just fashion and an attitude. And I think somebody could call that same fashion and an attitude feminine. This shit is all made up. It's all so made up. It looks so different culture to culture. To have short hair. It's like, it's all made up. So yeah, I appreciate that. Like when I hear you say, I don't know if there's anything in masculinity worth redeeming, that's similar to what I was saying when I was like, I think, you know, masculinity is swag. Like femininity is swag. It's a way of being. It's a kind of a cultural understanding we share right now. Right now, 2020, high heels are considered feminine. Great. We can call them masculine if you want. Great. It almost doesn't even matter. It's more about just having language that we all understand, but nothing is like set in stone. And yeah, that I want to be sensitive towards that, because there are people who feel very strongly like, yo, I am masculine. And because of how their body looks, other people are telling them, no, you are not. And they're like fighting for their masculinity because that's an identity, that's a swag that feels central to who they are. And I'm not telling those people, fuck that. That's not central to who you are. I'm just saying that we're all going to experience that differently, and that's okay. And I tend to agree with the idea that like it's fashion, it's an attitude. Like what is masculinity is like asking what is grunge. To me, it's like asking what is punk, what is hip hop, what is you know, whatever. Like those things are always growing and expanding. And you know, I love grunge. I was just listening to Nirvana this morning. But if somebody were to make a song with hella synthesizers and say this is what grunge is now, I mean, the grunge heads would probably be like, no, it's not. But who's to say that it's not? Like there's, you know what I'm saying? It's just a living, growing thing. It's just swag. Oh, like it's not, it's, yeah. I think it's just important that we acknowledge it and affirm it in people, if that's what they identify with and that's what they identify as, but not that we try to make it like these hard set in stone rules, because that ends up actually boxing people out. And it's just not true. All this stuff is made up. So I hope that's helpful.
Very helpful. Thanks, Richie. I follow you on Instagram, and when I saw you listening to Nirvana this morning, I was like, yes.
Yeah. Hell yeah.
Yeah, that's sweet. Yeah, we have a question from somebody who's wondering about how you address like transphobia with men, and if that's part of your regular conversations. You know, if men are responsible for so many trans folks losing their lives, like how are we addressing that with other men, and what does that conversation look like for you?
Yeah, so I think it's important to point out that I'll talk about what I do like as an organizer and then what I just do as a person. In success stories is not a political education class. It's about helping people free themselves. And we believe that folks understanding transphobia is part of freeing themselves. Why? Because if you are basing your value on the fact that you are cis, then not only are you oppressing others, but you are repressing yourself. That's not integrity. That's not authenticity. You're not more valuable because you are cis. You're valuable because you are you. You're not more valuable than anybody. And whatever we're using to base our value on, besides our authenticity and integrity, is a detriment to ourselves and to others. So that's the approach from which that's how we approach the conversation of transphobia in success stories specifically. And it rings true for people. You see the light bulbs going off. They're like, damn, I've been hating trans people because I'm insecure. So now let's talk about your insecurity. The conversation of when we talk about transphobia, when we talk about heterosexism, when we talk about all that stuff, we have the conversation within one of our patriarchy workshops over the course of the program. And we define what it is and we make sure people understand it, and we ask a couple questions because it's very important. But ultimately what we need to get at is like, you are seeking to dominate others because you are insecure, fam. So let's work on that insecurity, and then you will no longer seek to dominate others. Yes, let's define these specific ways you've been doing it, whether it be transphobia, misogyny, racism, whatever it is. But until we get at that insecurity in you, it's gonna keep happening. So that's the way we approach it in Success Stories. The way I approach it as an individual is similar, because that's a methodology I really believe in, that men are oppressing others because of our own insecurity. But yeah, I mean, I'm talking to folks about transphobia often. I feel like it's just so fucking deadly. And this year has now been the highest year on record for deaths of trans and gender nonconforming people, which is wild to think. We'd like to be, with all the representation and everything we've been achieving as a culture in terms of visibility of trans folks, it's a hard pill to swallow to think that, wow, more trans people have been killed this year than, really? More now than in the 80s? More now than in the 90s, right? So there's so much work to be done, and I'll always talk about cis sexism and transphobia and push back when I hear people say trans shit and try to make songs and films that bring these concepts to the culture in like a mainstream, understandable way, because people are dying, and I don't think that we can really talk about patriarchy without talking about transphobia.
Thanks, Richie. You mentioned like your songs and your videos and stuff. How can people follow your work? What are the best ways to connect? What do you have going on right now that you're really excited about? Do you have any projects coming up that combat toxic masculinity that you can like give us some insight into?
Yeah, I think well, one, folks can follow me. I got my handle in my little box, and that my handle is the same for all platforms. And then I have a link tree in all my bios that links to all my various organizations, to my social impact media company, Question Culture, and all our different projects. We most recently did a video and a campaign for one of our artists. Her name is Inigo Mateo. She has a song called YQYG about street harassment, and we did a video / mini documentary about street harassment, so folks can see YQYG and some of the social impact stuff that we did around it, because we do an organizing campaign around all our major projects. We actually, hold on, I'm gonna show y'all some. We ended up making these cards. These are Indigo's ideas. She's so brilliant. Called Mind Your Business cards, that when folks are enduring harassment, they can give one of these cards to the person if they feel safe, and that person thinks like, oh, I'm lit, now I'm about to contact this person. But actually the email address and the Instagram on here takes them to a video series we made about like what is street harassment, how to intervene in street harassment, and how to stop harassing people in a way that is like dope and funny, and also like very clear, and invites men in to change their behavior. So that's the kind of shit that we like to do. These are completely free, by the way. So if you DM our record label page, which is @question.culture, and just give us an address, we'll send it to you. I'll put the Question Culture thing in the chat right now. Yeah, we just send these to folks for free. We got hell of them, so don't be shy. That's what they're for. That's the kind of stuff we do. That's the kind of stuff we make. We just did an album this year as well, a compilation album to support a bunch of defund the sheriff campaigns all throughout LA. We're able to bring on a bunch of major artists. Some of our artists, our artist 88, who's currently incarcerated, but not for long. Indigo, I got to produce a bunch of records on the track. Right now we're working on a film that I wish I could say more about, but I can't, but you'll know about it probably in a year from now. It'll be a thing. And we're working on Indigo's second album. And yeah, we're just always trying to make shit that's dope, that's accessible and can go far, and that challenges patriarchal culture, and that we can organize around. Everything we make, we use as an organizing tool.
Awesome. Super excited to be on the lookout for those things coming down the pipeline in the future. Little anticipation growing here. We have a question from somebody who says they're a cis het man and often struggle to like make connection with other cis het men, and wondering if you have any advice. I know you talked about vulnerability is like a tool for connection and something that you try to model in your sessions, but is there anything else you can say to this person about like building community and how that happens?
Yeah, it's hard, huh? Building vulnerability with cis het men is hard. But kind of to Paul's point, what I found is helpful is to model it. Because all of us are in this fucking cage, this patriarchal cage that doesn't allow us to be who we really want to be. And we all want out at some level, at some time. And when one of us pokes our head out, the other ones will too. And what I've learned is that when we model vulnerability and we show other people that it's safe to, that they will too. Yeah, I think it's easier one-on-one. I definitely recommend one-on-one or with smaller groups. Large groups of men, it's rough. Very male-dominated spaces like prisons, fire stations, sports, like male sports teams are going to be the hardest places to do it with large groups because everybody is kind of looking at each other just like those kids were. But in a one-on-one, modeling vulnerability has been what I've seen the best strategy to get other people to do it as well, to build genuine connections.
Awesome. As you were telling that story, I was thinking about like, you know, being in a room with a sports team and like watching the guys looking at each other, being like, can I say this and like still be respected? And yeah, for sure. Somebody is wondering if you have any advice for somebody who's struggling with self-hatred due to like internalized toxic masculinity, and if you have any like words of advice for them.
Ooh. I'd first just want to say that I relate to that. I relate to that, and it's really hard. I've like hated myself for my attraction to women because I've like connected it to like I'm only experienced this attraction in toxic ways. I've hated myself for like not being tough enough. So yeah, I relate to that, and thank you for sharing that. What has helped me is, it's scary, y'all. I wish I could offer something less scary, but what has helped me is to go for it and say the thing I want to say, feel the emotion that I need to feel, let out the cry that I need to let out, and understand like that it's not always going to go down the way that I want it to go. Sometimes I might feel embarrassed, but from the sake of my own authenticity, I gotta express what I gotta express it. Like I gotta feel the feeling. I gotta express the thing, so that it doesn't turn into that self-hatred, because that just spirals down. At least it did for me.
Thank you, Richie. Super related to that. I'm just gonna read this one because I don't want to like misinterpret it or anything, but they're thanking you, Richie. So appreciate your talk. They are a gender-based violence prevention educator who's been running healthy masculinity and consent workshops for 6 years. And they're concerned with how many practitioners or educators in the field don't practice intersectionality, and frankly are just very white. They appreciated how you addressed the intersections of race, queerness, and class, and patriarchy and masculinity. And they're wondering if you can speak about the harm that occurs about addressing masculinity only for white men and assuming that harm only occurs to white women, and how we can work to address this.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That should be so corny. I mean, I didn't come from that world. I came from doing this world. I started organizing on buses, on city buses, and then I started organizing in prison. So I've always worked with like working class and poor people of color, and queer people in particular. How do we address it? I try not to speak on what I really don't feel like I'm bringing lived experience to. So I didn't come from a college background. I don't come from a professional background. I have a degree, but I didn't like come from academia in that way where I was coming up against like super white feminists and white understandings of feminism. So yeah, I can't speak too much to it besides say what is true and understand that there's going to be consequences for that. And it means sometimes you don't get the grant or sometimes you don't get the whatever. I mean, right now, success stories, the prison system is, I guess that's not really the same, but we've had to give up money for sure for doing the work that we do because people want us to do it in those more, corny directions. I almost called it traditional, but it's just corny at this point. White supremacist patriarchal shit. Sometimes you got to take it on the nose to really do the work that needs to be done.
Thanks, Richie. Somebody's asking about anger. This is a male identified person, and they're talking about how like anybody can feel anger, but as a man who's like working on themselves, they're like hesitant to show it. Sometimes, can you speak to anger a little bit and how you think like it can be healthy or not, and what might be some like ways outside of our traditional notions of showing anger that could like still fit within your description of healthy masculinity?
Yeah, I think anger is an emotion. So part of it, see, the problem with toxic masculinity is it tells us that our only emotion is anger, right? Because it praises us for being violent. But when we understand that anger is just one emotion, I think it's important that we experience it and express it like any other ways. But I also want to circle back to what I was saying is the difference between self-defense and pride defense. For using if our anger is coming from a place of we feel like we're quote unquote disrespected as a man, or somehow like our male supremacy is not being recognized. Yeah, I think we should push back against that in ourselves. Feel the emotion, but let's push back against something that's coming from a place of pride. And let's make sure that we're not using anger as an excuse to destroy and to harm others.
All right. We have a question. As a non-binary but often male-presenting person, I largely still hold male privilege. I'm wondering if you have any advice regarding holding on to my rejection of gender as someone non-binary while connecting with men and challenging patriarchal behavior.
Yeah, I relate to that so much, and I know so many people who do too. I think it's important for us to understand that there's two things that are happening with gender. There's one, my internal experience, and two, there's the assumptions other people have on me. And if people are assuming things about me that give me privilege in the world, it's important to own that and to use that. And that actually doesn't have anything to do with your actual identity. Like, you can identify how you identify and feel how you feel, and that is 100% valid. And if people see you in a certain way, and offer you privilege based on how they see you, that's something that we can use. I mean, and I say I relate because I like toyed with the idea of like wanting to add like they pronouns and like using he and they, because I actually there's so many things in that box of assumptions of what a man is that I don't relate with. And I feel like by adjusting my pronoun just felt more authentic to me. And I ended up decided to just keep with he and him for the fact that I know I'm so masculine presented. And especially right now, I'm like wearing black and white, which I never do. But I actually, because I feel like it was just helpful. It's just helpful. The people who I work with, gang members and dudes that are locked up and shit, like for me, I didn't feel my gender dysmorphia wasn't so much to the point where it's like it feels inauthentic if people call me he and him and I'm like, who are you talking about? That's not me. I don't feel like that. So I decided I'm going to actually hold up. This is comfortable enough for me. And I think it helps me relate with the people who I'm trying to push. But even if I made a different choice, I know a lot of people who have, a lot of amazing leaders who use he and they pronouns, who use like Paul, and like who use like they pronouns specifically, like Yolo Akili of Beam, and my friend Vitali, who's one of my mentors. They both hold their authenticity and their experience and their identity so strongly, and the way that they're seen and the privilege that they're given as a tool to transform the world so strongly. And I think we can choose to do both.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Richie. I'm going to pass it back to Sarah. We're going to wrap up. I'm sorry to the people who we didn't get to their questions.
Thanks so much, Paul. I really appreciate you supporting that conversation. I also want to give a massive thanks to Richie for your time, reflection, vulnerability, passion, and just general badassery. This is the kind of the exact space we were hoping to achieve. And Richie, I also just want to create space to offer thanks to all the BIPOC women and non-binary folks, many of which you spoke about, who offered their emotional labor and help you get to a place to be able to offer such a valuable talk like this. I really, after 15 years of doing this, so deeply appreciate men and masculine folks for speaking up. And I always think it's important to create space to thank the women, femme, and non-binary folks for helping make this move forward. And it's often on their backs. Both those things exist in such a beautiful tension for me. This is exactly what we were hoping for. Thank you so much for this space. It was beautiful. I was getting texts and messages from folks all over the place at how much this was what they needed right now. It's obviously a hard time. It's obviously a hard time in this world. I just want to say that this event is a kickoff for the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, which starts tomorrow. And I really want us to use this talk to help us further mobilize ourselves into action rather than immobilizing ourselves, feeling like, we can't all be Richie. So what I encourage folks is talk to people in your lives, share resources online, show up for 16 days of action events in your area, organize your own, send messages of support to folks who organize and work with survivors, protest or engage in direct action against sexist, homophobic, transphobic, and racist spaces, speak up and challenge hard conversations, follow the direction of BIPOC, gender-based violence survivors and advocates, and the list goes on and on and on. It's really important that we ensure we are doing more than just consuming Richie's brilliance, which obviously you were brilliant, thank you. But please commit as you leave the space to something that you're going to do this week. We have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to do, and we need every single one of the folks who chimed in here to participate in it. Thank you, Richie, for letting us record it. We will be posting the recording online. I also just want to really quickly acknowledge that this is the Consent is Not Canceled, which is a 6-part speaker series featuring leading experts such as the badass Richie, who discuss approaches to address and prevent gender and sexual violence. This series is brought to you through a partnership with Consent Comes First, the Carleton University Sexual Assault Support Services, and Consent is Golden. Please follow Consent is Golden, Consent Comes First, and Carleton University Sexual Assault Support on social media, in particular Instagram, for more information. I want to give so much thanks to Farah and the Consent Comes First team, Bailey and the Carleton University Sexual Assault Support team, Dana from Consent is Golden, and Paul from Male Allies. Also much thanks to Kristen providing closed captioning even with all the difficulties we experienced with it. And just really quickly, a couple events coming up for those who are excited by that stuff. In January in the series, we're doing Consentful Tech with Una Lee from And Also Too. In February, we're doing Emergent Realities of Healing Justice, Misogyny Noir, and Black Life in Canada with Yami Meet M. And 2 quick things coming up as far as 16 Days of Activism. Ryerson is hosting an event on Misogyny Noir on campus. In your voice, your lips stop being able to move. Which is a really stacked panel with 4 speakers and looks really amazing from 12 to 1:30. So check out Consent Comes First. And that next week, Laurier, we're hosting a panel called Decarcerating Our Responses to Gender-Based Violence, which is a panel of really badass Black Indigenous folks who are trying to make more spaces for transformative restorative justice approaches. So please check out all those events. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And Richie, any last thoughts, feelings?
Honestly, I feel like you said them all so important. Thank you so much, Sarah, for just, I was raised and organized and trained by queer Black women. And that is how I got to have the freedom that I get to have and live with every day and be able to do this work. And so much thanks to my mentors and best friends and partners and all the people who've done so much work with me. And I just also want to re-highlight what Sarah said is this whole hour and a half is literally for nothing if we don't turn around and do something with it. So I hope that I offered something today that is a tool for you to go back into the communities and do this work for the sake of the results, right? For the sake of the survivors who exist, and also for the survivors who we hope never exist, because the violence never took place. That's ultimately what this is about. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to hopefully contribute to your toolbox.
Awesome, everyone. Thank you so much. Once again, check out Consent is Not Canceled. Check out Consent Comes First, Carleton University Sexual Assault Support Services, and Consent is Golden. And hopefully to see a lot more of all of you come to our events. And thank you for showing up. These conversations really matter, and we can't make change unless we're all in this collectively with more outcries. Thank you.